Hello everybody, my name is Brandon. Welcome back to the channel. I'm here today with my August 2020 book wrap-up. So I'm going to talk about all of the books that I ended up finishing last month. I ended up completing 9 books in the month of August, so the number is good. But fortunately, the star ratings on these are even better. It was a very strong month for reading for me, so I'm very excited to talk about these with you guys. Also, stay tuned to the end because I am going to bring up my stats again for the month. So if you're a stat junkie like me, stay tuned to the end of this video and we'll talk about all of my reading stats for the month of August. I can't wait. So, with 9 books to talk about, let's not waste any time. Let's dive right in. So the first book I finished last month was a difficult one to get through due to the subject matter. This is the true crime story called Columbine, written by Dave Cullen. This is one that actually ended up on my 5-star predictions list because I heard so many incredible things about it, and I definitely understand why so many people have rated this so highly. This was just exhaustively researched by the author, and he does such a phenomenal job of providing context behind this massacre. So, you know, obviously this is about the story of the high school shooting, of the Columbine high school shooting, which happened in April of 1999. So that would have made me 12 years old at that point, about to be 13. I would have been in middle school. No, I guess, yeah, middle school. I remember, you know, coming home at the end of the day and watching this on the news. It was just such a... It was so surreal to see it happening. I was of the age where it didn't have quite the impact on me that it would have if I was even, 3 or 4 years older, but it was still something that I can remember to this day. And so that's really my only connection to this. I never did a ton of research afterwards. It was always hearing the rumors, and finding out now, having read this story, that virtually everything I thought I knew about Columbine was not true. This was all stuff that came out like within the days of the massacre, and it all just stuck with me all these years later. You know, the trenchcoat mafia, them being bullied as they were growing up, and that's kind of being the catalyst that sparked all this, and so much more. But none of that's really the case at all. There was a trenchcoat mafia in the school, but they weren't really a part of it. They actually were the ones who did a lot of the bullying. They were not the bullies. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold are fascinating people to read about. It's such a tragic and sad story because there's clearly a psychopath amongst them, and he leads the other one to commit this heinous crime, which, would never have been on the scale it was if it wasn't with the two of them together. So it was just like a perfect storm coming together to create this horrific incident, and one that will stick with me the rest of my life, given my age. I don't know. This was so well researched that I feel like I don't really need to read anything else about Columbine because you get all of it that you could possibly want with this story. This is not a quick read. It's not an easy read, but it is incredibly well written. The only reason this did not get 5 stars for me was because I found it a little difficult to follow some of the stories of the victims. It's definitely a story about Eric and Dylan and their background, kind of what led them to this, at least as far as we can tell, and then basically some of the aftermath. But it is also very much a story about the victims, the survivors as well. And what Cullen tries to do is like paint a picture of all of these victims and all these survivors, but that gets a little muddy as it goes on because you hear so many different things about all these different people. Obviously, there was a ton of people at the high school at the time. And you just start to, or at least I did, I started to lose track of who was who, unfortunately. So I would have loved to have more of like a distinct, like start, middle, and finish to the, not the character, but the individual's story, so that I could follow it a little clearer. There were certain descriptors that stuck with me as we were talking about these individuals, like the boy who climbed out the library window and he ended up being paralyzed. His story is very clear, and so I was able to follow that kind of from start to finish as the book went on. But some others, if they were shot, but there was nothing else to kind of make them stand out in this world, in this situation, then it was just a little bit harder for me to follow those individual stories. So I think that's, I don't know if that's really a fair criticism, but it's the reason I ended up giving Columbine 4.5 stars as opposed to 5. Still, this is a book that if you are at all interested in learning more about Columbine, if you want to realize that you don't really know anything about it like I did, check this book out. So much of what you might know, if you're anything like me, is just not true. The media took a couple of very specific things, ran with them for like the first week or so, and those are what stuck. That's everything that I remember, at least, and frankly, it's probably what most people remember from this tragedy, and they're simply not true in the vast majority of these cases. So definitely a book that taught me a ton. I thought it was fascinating. It was horrific, but it was exactly what I wanted it to be. It's exactly what I want my true crime to be. I want it to teach me something, and this definitely did. So, like I said, I am giving Columbine by Dave Cullen 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I definitely think this is one worth tracking down if you are at all interested in true crime, or you remember the Columbine massacre, or just simply want to know more about it. Definitely check this one out. So from something very heavy to something a little lighter, well, sort of lighter, I guess. It's lighter because it's fiction as opposed to, fact. But this is book 3 in the Themis files, which I talked about the first 2 books last month. This is book 3, which is Only Human. And these are written by Sylvain Nouvel. And again, I apologize, I'm probably butchering that name. But this was the conclusion, the end of the trilogy of this story. And it was fantastic. It might be my favorite book in all 3 of them. The way it wraps everything up was so interesting. It jumps ahead again another about 10 years from the end of book 2. And somebody described it to me as jumping the shark, but I don't really feel like it did. It definitely took the story in a different direction, but it was so fascinating to me. And there is so much politics in this one, even more so than the second book, which was a lot more politics heavy than the first book. But I love that about this story. Like, this series is able to do so much in 3 books. And that's that, it's very succinct, but it's done so well. This is, I don't want to talk anything more about it, I guess, because then that would give spoilers for, either book 1 or book 2. So I will leave it at that. I will keep it very, very brief. I thought this was awesome. I enjoyed this trilogy so much. If you have not checked out this trilogy yet, it's definitely worth your time. And again, this is a mixed media story. So there are, interviews, it is journal entries, newscasts, things like that. So the only way to read this book, as far as I'm concerned, is via audiobook. Now, I will say something about this audiobook that kind of was frustrating, which I didn't get in the first 2 audiobooks, but the casting of it was a little off because they cast people that sounded similar to one another. And so I was hearing a male character and I couldn't really distinguish who was who. It took a few lines for me to kind of break them apart. When they finally started talking about, things that were distinct to their character, I finally understood who they were. But that was the only annoying part, was simply the audiobook casting. It happened with some of the male characters. It happened with some of the female characters as well. So something to keep in mind. It didn't kill the book at all. It didn't really hinder it that much. It's just something I noticed as I was going through, which I found a little bit annoying. But other than that, this is an excellent trilogy. Check out the Themis Files if you've not heard it. So I am giving Only Human 4.5 out of 5 stars. Another trilogy I wrapped up last month was the Star Wars original trilogy in novelization form. So this is Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, and this one was written by James Caan, based on the screenplay by Lawrence Kasdan and George Lucas, of course. So this is episode 6. I probably don't need to talk too much about it, but the Empire is rebuilding and the rebels are trying to, first they need to get Han back. They need to rescue Han because, of course, he ends up in the carbonite at the end of episode 5. I guess that's a spoiler, but everybody knows that, so it's not really a spoiler. But yeah, anyway, this book was really, really good. I don't know which one's my favorite of the 3 novelizations, but this one, it very well could be. And it's interesting because even though I love the story of this, which is what makes it probably my favorite of the 3, I think that the writing is probably the least in this. It is the lesser of the 3. James Caan, he does a good job, but I feel like he doesn't really hold a candle to Alan Dean Foster in the first one. And then I'm forgetting who wrote the second one now, but I felt like the writing was a little, I don't know how else to say, just a little bit lesser than in the first two. Like I said, when I was reading Alan Dean Foster, I felt like I was reading up, like I was reading something that was just smarter than I am. Where here, I kind of felt like I was on the same level, which is fine. Most of the time, that's how you feel when you're reading it, but I had just gotten to a place with these Star Wars books, with these novelizations at least, that I felt like it was just a little more smartly written, which is not to diminish James Caan at all. I think he does a fine job with this. And he puts together this story really, really well. I mean, is there a lot here that's not in the movie? Not that I was able to pick out, at least. I haven't seen the movie in a little bit. But I didn't really notice much that wasn't already included in the film. But it's still fun to hear that inner dialogue with these characters that I already, know and love. So if you are at all interested in the Star Wars universe, I don't know that there's a whole lot to gain by reading these novelizations, but I will say that I enjoyed the hell out of reading these novelizations, plus Splinter of the Mind's Eye. So I am now 4 books deep into the Star Wars universe, and I love it. So I actually just picked up episode 7, but I don't think I'm going to go that way. If I did novelizations, I would go back to episode 1 next. That said, I think I am going to move on to the Thrawn trilogy. I'm just kind of taking a little bit of a break at this point, at least for the month of September, because I did just finish up this trilogy. So I don't know. I don't know when I'm going to get back to these, but I imagine it's going to be sooner rather than later. And I think, don't quote me on this, but I think the next thing I'm going to go with is the Thrawn trilogy, which the Thrawn trilogy, of course, takes place after the events of episode 6. It's no longer canon, but it is kind of the original way the story went, I guess. It is the first interpretation of what happened after episode 6. So I'm very interested to read how that goes. So I ended up giving Star Wars episode 6, Return of the Jedi by James Caan, 4 out of 5 stars. Next up was a book that was on my 2020 medias to consume list, and this is Stranger in a Strange Land, written by Robert A. Heinlein. So this is, I guess I should mention first that yes, there is, some of that misogyny that you would expect from Heinlein is in this book for sure. There are some lines in here that really had me cringing just because they are so of its time, which it wasn't right then, and it's much less right now, but it's there, and that's just the way it is when you go back to these old novels, especially when you read a Robert A. Heinlein novel. But if you've read any of his other work, you probably come to expect that at this point, but just know that some of that is in this. So Stranger in a Strange Land is the story of a Martian living on Earth, essentially. At the beginning, a group of astronauts head out to Mars, and they end up finding a man living there. They end up bringing him back to Earth, and then it's the story of how he will acclimate to life on Earth. There is obviously a whole heck of a lot that goes on in, kind of the middle there, but that's really what the story is all about. Something I found fascinating about this book were the little things that Heinlein adds in that makes it clear that we are not living in like today's Earth or what would have been 1961's Earth. Actually turns out that it is like a post World War III Earth, and things are different. They have different technology. They have just different ways of living. I don't know. It was really interesting because that wasn't jammed down your throat. It was like little things here and there as the novel was going on. That's like,
oh, that's not normal.
And it makes you think. So I thought that was really cool. I love the way how he kind of sprinkled in some of the futuristic aspects of this novel. I thought that was really cool. So this story is essentially broken down into 3 major parts. The first part is him, getting to Earth and then how the government's going to handle it. The middle part is him living with what is essentially like a commune of sorts. And then the third part is him kind of breaking out on his own and going from there. So I'm being incredibly generic. I don't want to give any spoilers at all, of course. But I will say I really liked the first part. I was like gripped from the start. I wanted to know what the heck was going on. The middle part definitely gets long in the tooth at points. And then the third part I thought introduces a lot of really interesting ideas. Like frankly, through the whole thing, there is just so much discussion about religion and politics in this, which I tend to enjoy. But if that is not something that you're interested in, you might not like this one all that much because it is very heavy-handed with ideas and just kind of the ideology of religion and politics. So word of warning there. But I think Heinlein does a good enough job of keeping things interesting through each part as it goes. Each part had its own kind of feel to it, which I didn't expect. And there are definitely interesting moments no matter which part you're reading. It's just there are some other moments that, man, there's a lot of talking. There was one character in this who I really, when he started out, I didn't like him at all because he was just the most semantic. Is that the word I'm thinking of? Yes. It was very semantic and I just didn't enjoy him at all. But then as he goes on kind of through the second part, it's like, well, he's using that to help our main character. So I started liking him more. But because of that, there's just so much dialogue. He just talks and talks and talks, kind of like I do in all of my videos, but he just doesn't stop talking a lot of the time. And so he gets a little long-winded, which is not necessarily, there probably, could have been some cutting done there, but it's okay. I think the character is likable enough that it works. So while this is not one that I will probably read again, and not one that I terribly loved, I did enjoy it. I did feel a little long at points. It felt like I was reading this for a lot longer than I was. I should mention I did this on audiobook. I own it thanks to Chirp Books. So I got it for like $3 or something, super cheap a while back. But so, I think it was good. The narration was really well done. The narrator was excellent for this, in fact. If you are interested in the story, the audiobook is definitely a solid option to go with. But I don't know. This one was good, not great in my eyes. So I ended up giving Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next up was a book I was super excited to get for my birthday from my wife, and that is The Forgotten Island by David Sodergren. So first, look at that cover. It is incredible. It looks like the art was done by Trevor Henderson, and it's awesome. So this is a self-published book from 2018, and of course, I have the physical copy, and that's how I read it. Boy, did I love this book. This is just incredibly gory. Incredibly, there's sex, there's gore, there's blood, there's violence, there's drugs, there's everything you could want out of a horror film is in this book. And so, I loved it. So basically, this is about these two sisters who have basically disconnected. And so they are trying to reconnect and decide to go on a trip to Thailand together. They are two British girls. While they're there, they end up getting drunk at this party they attend one night. And they end up basically stealing a boat with this group of other people they meet. And they end up at this island where something odd is going on this island, and they're trying to figure out what the heck's happening. So this is, like it says, it is very much combining the cosmic horrors of H.P. Lovecraft with the grimy sensibilities of the video nasties. I mean, that's pretty much the best way to describe this. This is not just a slasher book. It's not basically the equivalent of a slasher film. It is definitely more Lovecraftian than that. And frankly, I don't know. I wouldn't have seeked this out if I realized that before going into it. I thought it was just like cannibals on a island. That's not really what it is. I don't know. I absolutely love this one. I think it was so well written. The characters are incredibly likable and incredibly despicable. Sometimes at the same time and often not. But they're so well drawn. Like, I was engaged from the first chapter. I ended up reading this one very quickly, which is unusual for me with a physical book, especially, a non-middle grade book. It is about 300 pages, and I got through this very quickly for myself because I didn't want to stop reading. It was just so well done. I am a huge David Sodergren fan now, and he has a couple more novels that are both in my Amazon cart that I will definitely be picking up soon. One of them is like a slasher film put in book, and I can't remember what the third one is, but yeah, I definitely am checking out more of his work. So this is a self-published horror author that you should absolutely check out. It is so much fun, so great. Cannot recommend this enough. If you are a horror fan who can take gore and just disgusting situations spelled out very vividly, this is definitely a book for you. So The Forgotten Island by David Sodergren, I ended up giving 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next up, I actually did a Josh Malerman doubleheader here. I'm going to talk about the first one I read first, though, and that is Bird Box by Josh Malerman. So this, of course, is very popular now thanks to the Netflix film with Sandra Bullock, which I've not seen, and I specifically wanted to read the book before I watched the film. So now that I've done that, I can finally watch the movie. So Bird Box was released in 2014, and I ended up listening to this on audiobook thanks to Hoopla. So with Bird Box, we come to discover that people started seeing something and then going crazy and they started trying to kill each other. And so in order to survive this now post-apocalyptic world, people basically have to blindfold themselves if they want to go outside. And so they stay inside as much as possible. Of course, we are in this, when we're introduced to our main character, Mallory, she is trying to flee where she is to find basically greener pastures, a place that she has heard about, that she is trying to get to for safety. Of course, things are going to go not quite as easily as she hoped, but obviously we wouldn't be reading her story if they did. So this is told through a lot of flashbacks. Like our main story is, or our main plot is Mallory trying to get from point A to point B. And then every other chapter or so, we are flashing back a number of years in order to kind of discover why she is or how she is where she is. So I think it's told in a really intelligent way that keeps you interested from start to finish. The story itself was really interesting. The idea of there being something that you can't look at and you don't know what it is. It could be literally anything when you look outside because you don't know what it is that is driving these people crazy. I thought that was really fascinating. And so, not being able to have sight was really cool. And it's interesting because the next novel I'm going to talk about is all about the sense of hearing. And so very clearly, Malerman is a fan of doing books that have to do with your senses. But so this takes place in Detroit, and I thought it was very interesting because, and I don't remember if it was this book or the next one, but so the author, Malerman, lives in Ferndale, which is like 20 minutes north of me. And so I know the area very well, and his stories take place in this area. And so one, I loved reading about that because you don't typically find a lot of stories that take place in areas that you are living. Well, you might if you live in like New York City or, a big city like that, but Detroit is not used a ton. And so I thought it was really cool to have this area, specifically, the Metro Detroit area in this book used. But the narrator saying words that you are familiar with, like city names or street names that you've just grown up with. And so how to say them is just ingrained in you. Hearing the narrator, who is not from this area, clearly say them incorrectly was quite jarring, but not his fault. And I only noticed it, a handful of times in between this book and the next one I'll talk about. But that was something that I just hadn't experienced before. And so it stuck out to me. That aside, though, I think this is a really well-written story. My only real complaint was the ending. And it's not that it's a cliffhanger or anything like that. The story is wrapped up enough, but Malerman introduces some things at the end that it feels like you could have had another couple of chapters. And I know there is a sequel to this called Mallory, which obviously is going to continue following our main character. But I don't know, from what I've been told, I don't know if it exactly picks up from the end of this or not. And so I'm really interested to check that one out. I probably will at some point because I enjoyed this story well enough. So like I said, I think this was a really well-written story, and I'm very interested now to check out the movie because you're either one that loves the movie, hates the book, or you hate the book, love the movie. Maybe not necessarily like that, but that's what I've heard a lot of. And so I'm very interested to see what I think of the film. There is a lot of intrigue here. I was definitely on the edge of my seat, so to speak, as I was going through this, because there are just different elements that are introduced throughout, different characters that are introduced throughout that are really fascinating, and I needed to know what was going to happen with them. And so for that, I really enjoyed it. So I like this book. I ended up giving Bird Box by Josh Malerman 4 out of 5 stars. So the second half of my Malerman doubleheader was called Black Mad Wheel by Malerman, of course, and this was released in 2017. So the reason I stumbled across this one was because as I finished Bird Box on Hoopla, it said, hey, you might like this one as well. And so I decided, you know what, it sounds interesting. Let's give it a shot. So in Black Mad Wheel, again, takes place in Detroit, so I love that. I didn't realize this was a period piece, though. This actually takes place like in the 50s. It's after World War II. Our main characters is they're actually a band that all fought together in the war. They're all war veterans, and they are essentially called back to duty because there is a sound that the army has discovered, and they've sent 2 other groups of soldiers to it to find out the source of the sound already, and they've not been able to find it. So they figured, hey, let's get a group of musicians that, were ex-military, get them back together and see if they can figure out the source of the sound. They are offered a ton of money in order to accept this trip. It's supposed to only be like 10 days, and then they come on back and they're essentially rich. And so they all decide that, this is the right thing to do. Let's do this. Much like with Bird Box dealing with sight, Black Mad Wheel deals with your sense of hearing. And this sound is able to bring people to a state of vomiting. Like, it makes them physically ill when they hear this sound. And so trying to find the source of this is going to be a lot more complicated than they first expected. Unfortunately, this one didn't quite do it for me in the same way that Bird Box did. I think it is still well written, but the story itself, I just was not connecting with at all. I don't know if it was the fact that it was a period piece or what it was, but I just wasn't connecting with these characters. I didn't care about them nearly as much as I cared about the characters that were introduced in Bird Box. And I know it's not really fair to compare the 2 books, but they're written by the same author. They both deal with senses. I think it's going to happen naturally. Again, this is one specifically, I know they talked about Mackinac Island, which is a very famous, it was Mackinac City or Mackinac Island, very famous here in Michigan, going up to the UP. And the narrator called it Mackinac Island or Mackinac City or whichever one it was. And so I was just like cringing at that point because, again, it's just something I know. Not at all a fault of the book, just something I wanted to point out because it stuck with me. So this one is told in a very similar style as Bird Box, where we have our main plot of our main character is basically back from this expedition. He's in the hospital. And so then it's flashbacks to what happened to get him there. So with Bird Box, I would say I was most interested in the present day, what was happening, with her getting from point A to point B. Whereas with Black Mad Wheel, I was more interested in the past. And I think that's by design with this one. It is a story of him being in the hospital. So, how entertaining is that going to be? I think the dialogue is well written there, and it is interesting to see kind of where he goes and or the states in which he, starts from and then ends in. But to me, it just wasn't as interesting as kind of how he got to this state. You are introduced to a lot of different characters, and this is another one where I was just having a hard time keeping them all straight. The band members don't really have anything distinct outside of like the main character that makes them stand out to me. I was trying to remember as we got later in the story, I was trying to remember back to like when they were introduced and how who was who, and I just was not able to do it. I couldn't remember specifics about any of these characters. So, that's probably more of a me thing than the book being, bad by any stretch, but I just wasn't able to connect with these characters at all. So, I thought this was, again, well written, just not my cup of tea. I much preferred Bird Box. So I still enjoyed this one, just not nearly as much. So I ended up giving Black Mad Wheel by Josh Malerman 3 out of 5 stars. All right, we're going to wrap it up with a couple of middle grade books here. First up is Star Wars Galaxy of Fear. This is book number 1, and this is called Eaten Alive. So this whole series was kind of sold to me as being Goosebumps set in the Star Wars universe, which obviously, yes, that is something I'm interested in. I'm a huge fan of Goosebumps, and I love the Star Wars universe, so I thought this would be right up my alley. Fortunately, it was right up my alley. I loved it. But I would not necessarily call it Star Wars in the universe. I would more lean toward calling it Animorphs set in the Star Wars universe. The first reason for that is because it feels very sci-fi heavy versus horror, at least this first book. There are horror elements, but to me, the sci-fi was much stronger. The second reason I would call it more Animorphs than Goosebumps is because we are following this family, Tosh and Zach. They are brother and sister. So their parents were actually killed when Alderaan was destroyed in episode 4. And so because they were off planet at that point, they were spared, but they have no other family to go to other than their Uncle Hool. And so Hool is a Shidi. I don't even know how you'd say it. I think it's SHI, IDI. And so basically he's like a shapeshifter. And so he's very mysterious though. And so they don't know a lot about him. He doesn't talk to them all that much. He's kind of just there. Instead, they have DV9, or DV for short, who is like essentially this story's C-3PO. He is their babysitter, basically. So DV9 is said to be like this ultra intelligent robot who was made for very specific things that were much above what he's doing now, which is basically being a babysitter. So he's very snarky and clearly doesn't like the role that he's been thrust into, but he tries his best to take care of these kids. In Eaten Alive, they are actually traveling to, and it literally just hit me. Take a look there. You're probably smarter than I am, so you'll get it before me. I was calling it Devorin, but it's clearly Devourin. Eaten Alive, devouring the world that they're on, is trying to devour people. That's what the whole story is about. I don't know how that just hit me, but anyway. So they travel to this planet, and something is clearly amiss. Something is not right. What I really thought was cool about this is that not only does Tosh have a fascination with the Jedi Knights, maybe it's kind of hinted at that she might have some of the Force within her. So that's interesting. I'm very intrigued to see where they go from there with this, with that idea. And then also we get our main heroes from Star Wars. So you have Princess Leia, Han Solo, Chewbacca, and Luke. And so you get all of these characters in this book. They actually show up on Devourin and help them out of a sticky situation. So that was really cool. I loved having them show up in this, even though it's like so ridiculous. I still really enjoyed it. I thought this book was really well written. It's not one that talks down to its middle grade audience at all. And I think when a book does that, when a middle grade story does that, it's more difficult to enjoy as an adult. But it didn't do that here. I didn't feel that way at all. And so this is one that I definitely enjoyed the writing style of. Something that you do get that is very Goosebumps is like at the end of a chapter, it's like something crazy just happened and then the chapter ends. And so it makes the young reader want to continue on to see what happened. And of course, it's like never anything that's implied. It's always the cat in the closet or something equivalent to that. But it's still fun. So that definitely felt Goosebumps-ish to me, at least. This is just a fun middle grade book that I am really excited to continue on. There's not a whole ton in this series, and I think I own like 1 and 2, and then 4, 5, and 6, I believe. And so I do need to pick up the rest, but I think there's only 10 to 12 books in this series altogether. So it's one I definitely hope to complete. And it's starting off really, really well. So really enjoyed this. If you are at all interested in Animorphs or Goosebumps and you enjoy Star Wars, you'll probably get a kick out of this one. I also like the fact that this book was released in 97, and skateboarding obviously was very popular back then. And it doesn't talk about skateboarding, but it has like an equivalent to it. It's like a hoverboard skateboarding thing going on here. And I thought that was really fun. Obviously something to connect with that younger audience. I enjoyed that though. That was really cool. So I really like this one. I ended up giving Star Wars Galaxy of Fear, Eaten Alive, so book number 1 by John Whitman, 4 out of 5 stars. So the 9th and final book I read last month was book number 4 of the Animorphs series. This is The Message, written by K.A. Applegate. So this one actually is following the point of view of Cassie. So this is our first Cassie book. And I think that's the biggest problem I had with this one, is that it doesn't feel like a Cassie book at all. Unlike with the others' stories, they feel very specific to who their main character is. It was very clear I was reading a Jake story when I was reading book number 1. It was very clear that I was reading a Rachel story when I was reading her story, and so on. This one, it could have been literally any of their stories. We get nothing of like a personal nature with Cassie in this. Yes, we do talk about the fact that she is questioning whether or not going into a more intelligent creature. Obviously, you can see they morph into dolphins here, if you can tell. They talk about, is it right? Because this animal is smarter than some of the other things they've done. So is it right or is it wrong? Yeah, they talk about that. But that doesn't necessarily have to be in a Cassie story. They could have talked about that anywhere. We don't get anything with her other friends. We don't get anything with her family really, other than one small scene at the very beginning of the book. So it just didn't feel specific to Cassie at all. I felt like Cassie was shortchanged, and that was really disappointing. Because of that, this is probably my least favorite one of the series so far. But instead of getting Cassie, more personal Cassie, we get a ton of action, and the story is progressed a lot here. We are actually introduced to a new character. They meet a new Andalite, Axe. And so I was always curious who Axe was because I see him on like the back of the books when you get later in the series, and I was like, who the heck is Axe? And so now I know who Axe is, and I loved his introduction. I think it is such a cool character and cannot wait to read more about him. So even though we don't get a lot of Cassie here, you do get a lot of progression, which I really enjoyed. So even though it's probably my least favorite of the series, I still think it's a really well done book. But I ended up giving The Message, which is book number 4 of the Animorphs series by K.A. Applegate, 3.5 out of 5 stars. All right, so before I wrap everything up, let's talk about some of my statistics from the month of August. If I'm looking over here, it's because I'm reading what my stats are. So I'm going to put a graphic up onto the screen here, whichever side it ends up on, and so you guys can follow along with me. So format. I ended up reading 4 physical books in August with 5 audiobooks, so 9 total. And then 2 things I added in new this month, so source and service. So source, I borrowed 3 and 6 were from my collection. Whether it was physical or digital, I owned them. The services I used, I had 4 from my physical book collection, 2 from Hoopla, 1 from Audible, 1 from Chirp Books, and 1 from Libby. So those are obviously audiobook services that I use thanks to my library membership. At least Hoopla and Libby are. The audience, I only read 2 middle grade this month, but I ended up reading 7 adult. No young adult, so I kept that off the list. And then genre breakdown, I read 1 true crime, 2 horror, and a whopping 6 science fiction. So keeping track of this stat has been very interesting to me because I thought I read a ton of horror, but I am definitely leaning more towards sci-fi at least the last couple of months. So that's interesting to me. And then we have the page count. So I was very, very happy with these stats. So I ended up reading 2,656 pages last month, which was a notable increase from the previous month. My total listening time, so this is just audiobook specific, I listened to 56 hours and 16 minutes of audiobooks. Crazy. I should mention my total pages. I do convert my audiobooks into a page count. Basically, I just go on Goodreads and I find like the most popular edition and I type in whatever number of pages that book is to count it for the page count number. So my average page count per book was 295 pages a book, which makes sense because I have, I read a couple really long ones, but I also have a handful of those shorter middle grade or a couple of those shorter middle grade books. So that makes sense. And then this stat I was very happy with. My average pages read per day, so this includes, again, everything I read last month, was 86 pages a day. That's awesome. Like, that's every day in the month of August. To think I read, on average, 86 pages a day really blows my mind. Last month, I think it was only like 50-something. I don't have the stat offhand, but it was only 50-something. So very cool to see that I read 86 pages a day on average in August. And then finally, the miscellaneous section. So this month had a really good average rating at 3.94. That's almost 4 stars as an average amongst 9 books, mind you. That's awesome. My average days to complete a book, so I also keep track of when I start the book and when I end it. And so the average time it took me to finish a book was 9.22 days. I will mention, I started episode 6, the Star Wars novelization, back in July. And so that took me like 40-something days to actually get through. So my stat is a little jaded thanks to that this month. But my average days to complete, 9.22 days. My highest rated book was 4.5, and there were actually 3 books at 4.5. Forgotten Island, Only Human, and Columbine, I all rated 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then my lowest rated book was Black Mad Wheel at 3 stars. So this was an excellent month for reading. I am so happy with everything that I decided to read this month because it worked out for me. So that is it for August 2020. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please let me know down in the comments below. Were there some in here that you loved, some that you hated? Let me know down there. And also let me know what you ended up reading last month. If you have a wrap-up video, go ahead, link that below. I'd love to take a look at that as well. All right, guys. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to Cinefessions here on YouTube. And if not, thank you anyway for watching this video. I really do appreciate that. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. I just want to say thank you all so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.